looks like we're getting there. Okay, so now the trick will be to make me co-host, or yeah, co-host. Hi, Nora, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
yes,
hi.
okay, and they have made me the host, so that's fine. I'm going to hang up the phone. Thank you.
Okay.
I was just calling in because quite often I find there's some kind of technical glitch. And
Okay.
okay, so I think I'm set. Go ahead, Nora.
I'm going to introduce you first. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to do a quick share screen just to make sure it's working, and then I will cancel it. Does that look okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, and it's whoops, I'm going to just click it so you see it changing, slides changing.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
You can watch it if you're in the room.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nora Kozuk. I am pleased and honored to introduce Rabbi Michael Lotker. Rabbi Lotker has a great deal of experience, knowledge, and an impressive background. He is a Phi Beta Kappa, Magna Cum Laude physicist, and spent the bulk of his career in the alternative energy business. He was ordained as a rabbi at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles. He is presently a rabbi for the Jewish Federation of Ventura County in California. Rabbi Lotker has also published a book entitled A Christian's Guide to Judaism. I hope you all enjoy his presentation. Okay.
Hey, thank you, Nora. Do you want to wait a couple of minutes? It looks like we're about a minute before the official starting time.
Oh, yeah, maybe I should have waited.
Okay.
Let me see the introduction again.
Yeah, it's okay. I will sort of introduce myself and be a little relaxed. I've never attended a Jewish event that started early. I'm just, and I know this is not a East Coast phenomenon because I grew up in the Whitestone area, so I'm right around the corner from you guys. So don't try and tell me that I'm just on laid back California customs.
Okay, we'll wait.
Okay.
While we're waiting, if I could just say one or two words, Nora, while we're waiting.
Please.
Hi, so this is Karen, and I just want to remind all of you that we have 2 more weeks for your return of the Shalach Manap order form. So please get it in before February 22nd. We will be packing all the Purim bags on Wednesday, March 1st. And we want to make sure that everyone's included.
The camera is on.
Purim is indeed coming.
It sure is.
Yes. Yes.
One of the things I'll mention is, in addition to what we're doing here, I conduct sort of Jewish learning sessions on Mondays and Wednesdays. Now it's at 7 o'clock Pacific time, so it's a little late for Easterners, although I do have a bunch of people from the East Coast that attend as well. And I'm just finishing up an intensive look at the book of Esther. We actually just read every line and looked at it very, very carefully and deeply. That actually is concluding tonight. And then next week, we're going to start a detailed, intensive look at the Passover Haggadah, getting ready for Passover. And so I'll mention it. Remind me, Nora mentioned it at the end because there's no charge for it. It's part of my job as a community rabbi for the local federation, and also work I do as a scholar in residence at Temple Adat Elohim.
Okay.
Well, let's see this.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and as a reminder to folks to mute yourself, I can mute you too. So wait another minute and then we'll get started. So Nora, is this a series that the synagogue runs of speakers or programs or? You're muted, Nora.
Sorry, we try to get a speaker once a month or so, yes.
Mhm, mhm.
And that doesn't always work out, but most of the time it does.
Okay. These, by the way, are sisterhood programs.
Right.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I'm doubly invited, not to the Sisterhood program, not being penalized for my Y chromosome. And in fact, the programs I conduct on Monday night started out as men's Torah study. And then with COVID, everything went to Zoom. And so we now usually have more women showing up than men.
Okay.
Okay, so I will officially start. Nora introduced me a few minutes ago. I'm Rabbi Michael Lotker. It is my honor and pleasure to be here to talk about how a scientist views religion, God, and belief. And by the way, if you have your slide rules, this is the time to, I'm only kidding. I am qualified to talk about this because I spent my first career as a physicist working in alternative energy, in solar energy, wind power, geothermal energy, and even some exotic nuclear things. I mean, we can talk more about alternative energy if there's interest. And then at the tender age of 50, I enrolled in rabbinical school. I'll say more about my my Jewish background. And so now a 5-year full-time program, and now I'm celebrating my 20th year in the rabbinate. So those of you who did bring your slide rules can figure out how old I am. I'm going to do a share screen and for a PowerPoint presentation. Nora, I'll look for you to give me a thumbs up to make sure you can see it and everyone can see it. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so there's my titles. Community rabbi for the local Jewish Federation in California, scholar in residence at Temple Adat Elohim, also in California. I have a website. I'll talk, well, I think it's the next slide is the website. Yeah, so I have a website. It is frighteningly easy to set up your own website, which should make you even more skeptical about what you see and read on the internet. So when you jump onto my website, you'll see a menu selection for classes. And then it's not the best organized website in the world because I organized it myself. But if you scroll down, you will see, you know, a topic in my classes for science and religion. Looks like I titled it here, Conflicts, Confusion, and Clarity. And I've done this presentation, kind of a one-time presentation quite often. And I also have a 3-session version of this talk. So 3 sessions of a little over an hour each. So if you just click on this link, you will see YouTube videos of those 3 sessions. I have a bibliography of reading materials on the subject. And I have a collection of, I think, wonderfully interesting, significant quotes on science and religion. I do want to make this a little interactive. We don't have a huge group of people, so I think we can do that. So I'm going to first ask a question. When I came down for breakfast this morning, there was a teapot boiling on my stove. So here's a question for you. Why was the teapot boiling? Somebody want to just unmute and offer a quick answer. Why was the teapot boiling?
The water reached 212 degrees.
Okay, yes, there's all kinds of science and physics. I could talk for 20 minutes and put you all to sleep on the thermodynamics of boiling water. So answer number 1 is because the stove heated the water to its boiling point. Aristotle called this the efficient cause, how the phenomenon takes place. But there's another answer. There's another reason why the water was boiling. Anybody want to take a shot at that? Hearing none, I will just put the answer. My wife wanted tea. Those are 2 answers to the questions. Why was the water boiling? Aristotle called this the final cause, the reason the phenomenon takes place. So do we have to choose between one correct answer and one incorrect answer, or can both be correct? I think clearly in this case, it's pretty obvious that both answers are correct. So here's another question. Why is there a universe? Answer number 1, everything we know and a lot we don't know about physics and cosmology and the origin of the universe. I'll talk a little bit about those issues, the origin of the universe. And answer number 2 is because God wanted a universe. And so, of course, the question once again is, do we have to choose between one correct and the other incorrect answer, or can both answers be correct? This is really the response to what I often hear, that you either have to choose science or religion, and they both can't be true. I'll quote very early one of those significant quotes about science and religion from a book called The Great Partnership by the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And he said, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. So I don't think that there is a conflict. And essentially, this whole talk is about amplifying on that thought. So ultimately, the key question here is the universe the result of God or simply a scientific phenomenon? Why am I so interested in this question? Well, as you heard, I have undergraduate and graduate degrees in physics. And then, although I went to Hebrew school and was bar mitzvah, I didn't step into a synagogue until my mid-30s. I was your typical left brain, mathematically inclined scientist. And then through tragedy in my life and my family's life, I started looking at deeper questions, and through Judaism, getting deeper answers. One of my friends characterized this as adult onset Judaism. Although I was born Jewish, I really didn't embrace my Jewish background and traditions until my mid-30s. I never attended a high holiday service in my life until my mid-30s. And clearly I went off the deep end on this subject. And, you know, as I mentioned, enrolled in Hebrew Union College. I'm ordained a Reform rabbi about 20 years ago. So very early in my exploration of Judaism, I came across what I believe are two powerful reasons. They're powerful reasons for me to act and live as though there is a God. And both as a rabbi and as a scientist, I like to choose my language carefully, choose my words carefully. I'm not speaking for proofs that there is a God right now, but the need to act and live as though there is a God. Reason number one is, if there's no God, there's no objective good or evil, but namely lots of people having lots of opinions about what's good and evil. Hitler thought he was doing the right thing. Stalin thought he was doing the right thing. I'm sure Putin thinks he's doing the right thing. Putin's not breaking any laws, you know, in the government of Russia. Hitler didn't break any laws in the Nazi regime of things. So just because he was obeying the local laws, does that mean what he was doing was okay? Clearly, none of us would say that that's true. So if it's more than just people's opinion or local laws, there has to be some higher source of good and evil. The second reason is, if there's no God, there's no intrinsic meaning to life. I like to illustrate it by this. Here's some sheets of paper. Actually, it's a talk I'm giving on Saturday called "Why Be Jewish?" So sheets of paper, these are organic hydrocarbons. If I burn these sheets of paper, I get water vapor, I get energy, I get carbon dioxide, and a little bit of ash left over. If I burn a baby, I get water vapor, I get carbon dioxide, I get some energy, and I get some ash left over. Speaking as a chemist, speaking as a scientist, there's really no difference between burning a child alive or burning a sheet of paper. I can't prove that's wrong. I just refuse to live my life as though this is one big biochemical accident and there's no intrinsic meaning to it all. Notice that this doesn't speak to the question of whether or not there is a God. This speaks to the question of, you could say, my own personal motivation for being religious. And by the way, I didn't really make this clear, but if you have questions as we go along. If there aren't too many questions, you can raise your electronic hand or frantically wave at me. I can see you all on my screen. Or we can have a Q&A session at the end. It's a little easier to do that than for me to monitor the chat, but we'll figure it out. So there are problems on both sides of this question. Those that reject God have to explain away the evidence for the existence of God, which I'm going to talk a lot about, and provide the basis for living an ethical life, which is really what I was just talking about. And for those of us who accept the idea of God and religion, we have to explain the basis for evil and tragedy in the world, and I will address both questions. So, having thought about this a lot, I believe that there are two key leaps of faith associated with God and religion. Leap of faith number one is there a God? And for purposes of this leap of faith, I would say I would define God as the intelligence behind the creation of the universe, a source of deliberate creation. That's leap of faith number one. Leap of faith number two is, does God care? Does the source of intelligence that created the universe care whether I have turkey or ham for dinner tonight? Does God care whether I am kind or torture people? Two, I believe, separate leaps of faith. And again, I'm going to address both. So question number one is, can we prove that God exists? And many people would say yes. I have a book actually written by a Catholic priest and a philosopher and someone very knowledgeable in science, Robert Spitzer. And the name of his book is New Proofs for the Existence of God. But I would say if we could prove God's existence, someone would have done it by now. And by that, I mean, rational people would all agree, yes, this is a proof, and we'd stop arguing about it. So, for example, no one argues that the earth is really flat. Yeah, I know there is a flat earth society, but even they don't take themselves seriously. We've proved that the earth is a sphere. We've actually proved that the Egyptians actually had ancient Egyptians had novel proofs of this. So that is proved. But there are reasonable, goodwill, intelligent people who would argue that God does not exist. I don't know if that was just a random noise or someone is asking a question. I'll go on. So what I want to talk about for a few minutes is evidence for God's existence. And this is evidence from science. And the evidence really revolves around the following idea. The laws of physics seem to be precisely tuned to allow for a physical universe. So let me start actually with the gravitational constant. So there's a very simple law. This comes from Newton about how gravity works. The gravitational pull. Oh, I even have a couple of things. Okay, this is actually a rock from Sinai. When I was in Sinai, I picked up a rock and took it home. This is just a sphere. If you have two masses, they attract each other with a force. The force is equal to the product of mass number one times the product of times mass, the value of mass number two, divided by the distance, the square of the distance between them. So if they're very close together, the force is greater. If they're far apart, the force is less, times some constant. That constant isn't dictated by any kind of law of geometry. It's just a number that we find to be true. If that number were much smaller, the good news is that we will instantly lose some weight. The bad news is if the gravitational constant were smaller, you might not have planets and stars being held together and things would fly apart. If the gravitational force were much greater, or even a little bit greater, the entire universe would collapse into one huge black hole. So, and there's no inherent reason why the number has to be exactly what it is. Well, it turns out if you go march through the various laws of physics, you find the same idea. In fact, the electromagnetic force, which we all learned about in high school science, which says that positive and negative forces attract, and if you have the same charges, they repel. If that force were that force keeps atoms stable. If the force were changed even a little bit, we would have no stable atoms. The same thing with the strong nuclear force. Like charges repel each other. So in the center of every atom is a nucleus, and the nucleus consists of protons, positively charged particles, and neutrons, non-charged particles, and they're very close to each other. So the force of repulsion in the nucleus of every atom is very powerful, and the fact that the nucleus stays together means there's even a stronger force called the strong nuclear force, which holds the atoms together. And as you'll see in a moment, if you tweak any of these numbers, we have a very uninteresting universe. And it's not only the numbers themselves, but the ratios of the numbers. So Martin Rees wrote an interesting book called Just Six Numbers, The Deep Forces That Shape the Universe. So here's some examples of that. We have the electromagnetic force between positive and negative charged particles. If you divide that by the force of gravity, you get a 1 followed by 36 zeros, a very big number. If you have a few less zeros, then the force of gravity overcomes the electromagnetic forces, and we have a very short-lived mini universe, and no opportunity for stars to develop, certainly not for other compounds or atoms to develop, no life. Another ratio, easy one to remember, is 0.007, which defines how firmly the atomic nuclei are bound. That's sort of what I was just talking about. If that number were 006, then the entire universe would be hydrogen. What's going on here is, if stars don't coalesce, you don't have these huge fusion factories where atoms of hydrogen combine to form helium, and then atoms of helium combine to form other heavier atoms. And of course, our body is made up of a lot more than hydrogen. If we tweak these constants a little bit, the entire universe is just thin hydrogen gas scattered over the volume of the universe. Absolutely no life, nothing interesting is going on. If that number were 008, then fusion would really take place at a very powerful level. I actually studied fusion as a power source when I worked on an alternative energy. But if you have too much fusion, we have no hydrogen. If we have no hydrogen, we have no water. And certainly life as we know it doesn't exist. So if you collapse all of this discussion into one result, what Spitzer talks about is the odds of an anthropic universe arising amongst all possible universes is a very small number. What do I mean by that? An anthropic universe is a universe that can support life as we understand it. Namely, you need lots of different atoms forming different compounds in a stable universe. And as you've just seen, those numbers can be tweaked, they can be changed. And overwhelmingly, if you make a change in any one of those numbers, you don't wind up with a universe that works or makes sense. The odds of all of it happening is 1 in 10 to the 10th power to the 132nd power. I can't write that number in simple form. Why? Because the number is so big that the number of zeros, if I tried to write it simply, would take up more than the volume of the universe if I wrote it in, say, 10-point type. Any questions on that? I'll pause for a second because it's not, this is a little complex. So I will just pause, and no questions, I will press on. There's other evidence as well. And one is also very powerful, which is the shape of Earth's orbit. So here's a little image, you're familiar with this, of what our solar system looks like. And according to the laws of physics, if you have two bodies orbiting each other, the shape of the orbit is an ellipse. And an ellipse can be quite eccentric. What I mean by eccentric, kind of stretched out. And if you look at, let's say, the orbit of Pluto, this is so old, Pluto was still a planet when it was made. That's typically what an ellipse looks like. But Earth's orbit is the most circular orbit by far of any planet in the solar system. And what that means is our solar radiation, which ultimately will mean our temperature, is pretty stable. If Earth's orbit was as eccentric, stretched out, as the next most circular orbit, we would have all the water on Earth freezing in the winter and a lot of it evaporating in the summer. And so we would not have a planet that is hospitable for life. Let's see, I just dropped this. Speaking of water, another really interesting example of what I would describe as evidence for God's existence is the property of water, how water behaves. As you know, you look at this glass and you see when water freezes into ice cubes, the ice rises to the top, right? This is something with which we are all familiar. That's counterintuitive in the world of science. Most things, when they freeze, they contract and they sink. So if you think about the way, I'm going to just mute this person right here. When you think about like wax or something in a vial, as it solidifies, the wax sinks to the bottom and the liquid floats on top, but not with water. What does this mean from the point of view of Darwinian survival of species? What it means is that in the winter, when water freezes, it expands and the top of ponds become frozen, right? The ice doesn't sink to the bottom of the pond. The ice rises to the top of the pond and we can go ice skating. I just saw this morning they canceled an ice fishing tournament somewhere because the ice was too thin, global warming. But if that didn't happen, what would happen is ponds would freeze from the bottom up. And little organisms that were being created, back in ancient times would freeze solid and not survive so well. There's no inherent reason why the water molecule should be so unique. And speaking of water molecules, this is the most technical slide I will show. There's another really interesting phenomenon. You're probably familiar with this phenomenon. If you jump into a lake and you dive down deep, you realize that as you go deeper, the water gets cooler, right? Again, because water, as it warms, reduces in density. So looking here, as the water warms up, the density goes down, and the water is lighter and it rises. And this is why, this is true of many objects like mercury. In your thermometer, as the mercury gets warmer, it expands and the mercury goes up the thermometer. Hot air balloons rise, so does water. But water, again, has this amazingly unique phenomenon that at 4 degrees C, the water, as it gets colder, actually gets less dense. So you have this maximum density at 4 degrees C, or about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So the bottoms of the lakes stay warm. They are they will always be the last to I'm sorry, the bottom of the lakes will stay at 10 degrees C, 4 degrees C as long as possible. Again, necessary for survival. Once again, I've talked with chemists about this. No one's ever really explained to me, I'm sure there's a good electrochemical reason, why the phenomenon, why this happens with the water molecule. There's lots of other reasons. It's hard to do this in a short presentation. We actually live in a very hospitable galaxy. You may not know this. The Milky Way is a wonderful galaxy. It's pretty symmetric. There's not a lot going on. There's not huge supernova and explosions going on in the center of the galaxy. And by the way, we are in the suburbs of our galaxy, of the Milky Way. If we were closer to the center of the galaxy, we would be bombarded by cosmic radiation. But because we're so far away from the center, we don't get that radiation. Our solar system is a wonderful solar system. Our sun, the star at the center of our solar system, is almost perfectly constant in its output. That's not so common. It's a single star. It's a single star. Most stars in the universe are double and triple stars. If our sun were like other suns, other stars in the universe, there would be two stars orbiting each other, which would cause wide fluctuations in temperature and tides and all kinds of things, making the planet a lot less hospitable for human life. We have wonderful planetary neighbors. One of our best neighbors is Jupiter. You may not think of this. Jupiter has a huge mass, and it actually shelters us from a lot of stuff that would come in and threaten to hit the Earth. As we know, when something hits the Earth, there's a dramatic impact. Jupiter helps protect us from this. Our moon, the moon was created from just such an impact. It is an enormous moon compared to the mass of the Earth. Lots of other planets have moons. As we've, certainly traveled into space, we find hundreds of moons, but there's no moon that is as massive compared to its host planet as is our moon. And that actually stabilizes the spinning of the Earth. The Earth spins on its axis, as you know. If we didn't have this stabilizing influence, the axis of the Earth would be flopping and fluctuating. That would play havoc with the seasons and would probably prevent evolution from occurring as it has occurred. And much, much more. There's a wonderful book called by Robert Piccioni. It's called Everyone's Guide to Atoms, Einstein, and the Universe. Here's just another example. The collision with this massive asteroid gave us the moon, and it also gave us a core in the Earth of molten iron, and there's an electric current running in the molten iron core, which gives rise to our planet's magnetic field. We know this because if you use a compass, you know that we know that the Earth has a magnetic field. But the magnetic field does something very, very important. And this is an illustration, what I did on one of my winter vacations. I went to northern Canada to see the northern lights. The magnetic field shields us from cosmic radiation that would destroy life and our atmosphere. Basically, the radiation comes in, it's charged particles, so it's deflected by the magnetic field to the north and south magnetic poles, where it starts entering the Earth, but never makes it all the way because the energy is removed by the deflection. And we see these beautiful northern lights. That's a picture of me freezing in about 20 degrees below zero weather, watching the northern lights. But without that magnetic field, our atmosphere would be stripped away from this cosmic radiation. That's what scientists believe happened on Mars. Mars once had an atmosphere, but because it doesn't have the kind of magnetic field that we have, it no longer has an atmosphere. Another example, my fuel for this talk is water, is DNA and life. As you know, the essence of life is the DNA molecule. So the question, and we know that life and DNA developed almost immediately on this planet as the Earth cooled. So the question is, was the appearance and formulation of DNA an accident, or was it guided somehow? The interesting thing is, although the discovery of DNA, I should put on this slide because I can never remember it, I think it was back in the 60s, the structure of DNA has been known quite a long time. Scientists to date have been unable to replicate a molecule of DNA in the lab, having all of control over all the chemicals and energy and so on. We've been unable to replicate a molecule of DNA, but somehow it happened on the Earth. So my friend Robert Piccioni actually did an analysis of this question in a book called Can Life Merely Be an Accident? So the question is, what's the probability that the DNA molecule was accidentally created? You can imagine a great soup of chemicals and lightning bolts and things, and out pops a molecule of DNA, and then you can have one-celled animals and it can start reproducing. So here's a great way of explaining the probability. rather than a 1 followed by lots and lots of zeros. So if I gave you a deck of cards and I said, I want you to pick the ace of spades from the deck of cards without making a mistake on the first time, your probability of doing this is 1 in 52. Everybody with me? I hope. Yes. I say that's too easy. I want you to do it twice in a row. To do it twice in a row without making a mistake, it's 1 in 52 squared, or 52 times 52, or 1 in 2,704. Still too easy. I want you to do it 5 times in a row without making a mistake. That starts to get into, super lotto probabilities. The probability of picking the ace of spades correctly 5 times in a row is more than 1 in 380 million. The odds that DNA was created in the universe as quickly as it was is equivalent to pulling that ace of spades 118,000 times in a row. People talk about the question of whether science and as expressed in evolution is inconsistent with the Bible. And there's one phrase in the Bible that I love to look back on, and that's in the opening book of Genesis, the opening book of the Torah, where in chapter 1, verse 26, it says, God said, let us make humanity in our image after our likeness. So the great theological question is, who is God talking to? For Christians, that's easy. God is threefold, so first person plural makes perfect sense. By the way, God only talks in the opening book of 2 or 3 books of the Bible in the first person plural. Quite often, God speaks in the first person singular. I am the Lord, your God, who took you out of Egypt to be your God, and so on. The Jewish response as to the question, who is God speaking to, is that God was speaking to the heavenly hosts, the angels and the seraphim, and on all those other folks that existed before creation. And the answer I like, it's a modern answer, it's not something I came up with, is that God was talking to the animals and to the rest of creation. And God says, let us make humanity in the image of the rest of this creation. So I look upon this verse as a proof text of evolution in the Bible. Bottom line on all of this, the evidence overwhelmingly convinces me that there is a God, and by God I mean an ordering intelligence in the universe. So again, if you have a question on this, I'll encourage you to raise your hand, wave at me, or just unmute and start asking. And having said that, I will now, if there are no questions at this point, I will move on to the second issue, and that issue is, does God care? If God cares, then we have to accept the idea of revelation. If God cares about us, it logically follows for me that God would communicate such caring to us. That's what religious people mean by revelation. And as you know, different religions have different forms of revelation. In Jewish terms, our revelation is Bible and Talmud, and others would go on and say Midrash and so on. Again, we can talk about that a lot. So we have revelation, and now the question becomes, must I take revelation literally? As you see, my approach is to take revelation very seriously. That's why I love Bible study and Torah study and Talmud study and even study of mysticism and mystical texts, but I don't take it literally. So for Jews, the key question is, what happened on Mount Sinai? How are we Jews to understand and address the question of revelation? So what happened on Mount Sinai? Well, there's Charlton Heston, Moses, with the tablets of the law. Of course, in Jewish tradition, on Mount Sinai, God not only gave to Moses the tablets of the law, that's the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, 10 commandments, but the entire written Torah. And Judaism hangs also on the teaching that Moses also got the oral Torah, which becomes the Talmud. So the answer is, my answer is, something happened. Now the question is, do I have to take our record of that something literally, or can I understand that it is the result of human witnesses receiving the revelation? So again, I will ask anyone to unmute as I ask the question, what is this? What are you looking at?
A cube.
A cube? Any other answers? Any other responses? Okay.
Box.
A box? Okay, it's actually projected light and shadow. If I was doing this on a screen, it would be on a screen or on your computer monitor. We interpret it as a three-dimensional or even a two-dimensional object because of our conditioning. Psychologists tell us that 90% of what we see is conditioned by our culture and expectations. We look at these different colors, Nora did, as representing 3 dimensions and shadows, or even, this as a box. But in fact, all it is a projection on your computer monitors. I submit to you that this affected what was written down at Sinai. Here's another one. This is my favorite. We exist immersed in an electromagnetic spectrum. And the spectrum goes from gamma rays to radio waves to shortwave, FM, TV, radar, cell phone, even longer waves than gamma rays. And we can only see a very small fraction of the total electromagnetic spectrum. We're only aware of a very small fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum around us. So here's another question. I'm actually looking for an answer. If the total spectrum I represent as 3,000 miles, the distance between you and me, this morning for me, afternoon for you, if the total spectrum is that big, how big would you guess is the fraction of that you can see? Anybody want to hazard a guess? If you understand the question. Nobody wants to guess. You cowards, there's no penalty for being wrong.
I would think it's less than an inch.
Less than an inch? I would agree with you. Any other guesses? The answer is smaller than the diameter of a hydrogen atom. We can only perceive a very tiny amount of what's going on around us. Thank God. Imagine if right now you could detect every AM and FM radio channel. If you could detect every cell phone communication going on around you, it would be an utter cacophony. So we only detect a small amount of what's going on around us. I would argue something happened at Sinai. God and humanity interacted. What gets written down in our Torah is affected by our perceptions, by our psychology, and also by the limitations of communication. So that raises the question, is doubt okay? Is doubt okay? Are you allowed to doubt and be a good Jew, for example? And I think about the generation of the Exodus. So think about those folks, whose story we're going to be celebrating pretty soon in Passover. So the generation of the Exodus saw some pretty powerful miracles. People will come to their rabbi and say, Rabbi, if I could see a miracle in my life, then I would believe in God with absolute certainty. Not $1 billion lottery, but just a few $100 million lottery, a small miracle. If I only had one of those in my life, then I would believe. I believe the story of the Exodus, even if you don't believe the story of the Exodus, but the story of Exodus teaches us the opposite. Think about the generation of the Exodus. They saw some pretty amazing miracles, yes? They saw the 10 plagues, water turned into blood, darkness, death of the firstborn, all of these incredible miracles. They are wandering in the desert and they get water and they get manna and they come to the sea and the sea splits and they get through the sea and the sea crashes in on the Egyptians chasing after them. If there was a generation that would have absolute certainty, you would think those would be the people. Now, Moses tells the Israelites, I'm going up on the mountain. I'm going to, meet with God. I'll be back in 40 days. And the rabbis say there was a controversy about whether Moses was going to be back on the 40th day or the 41st day. So therefore, the people lost faith. And Aaron, Moses's brother, the high priest, for crying out loud, makes the golden calf and says, this is the God that took us out of Egypt. So if that generation couldn't have perfect faith, how much more difficult would it be for our generation to have perfect faith? And for me, this teaches that doubt is necessary for free will. And I like to use what I call a police car example. You're driving along the highway at the speed limit, 65 miles an hour. And all of a sudden you realize you're starting to overtake a police car. So what does everyone do? Everyone slows down so they don't overtake the police car. I'm sure it's true there. It's true out here. There'll be a long line of cars behind this police car, empty space in front of the police car. Why do we slow down? Why don't we just zip by, thumb our nose at the policeman? Because we're pretty sure that if we did that, we would get a ticket. I submit to you that if we had perfect faith in God, rewarding good deeds and punishing bad deeds, it would be like driving your car, not only with the police car behind you, but with the policeman sitting in the passenger seat with a ticket book. If we knew with perfect certainty we would be rewarded and punished, we would lose free will. And I think at the essence of being human is that God wants us to have free will. And we struggle with this. And as you know, the name Israel, the name of our community, means one who struggles with God. As a rabbi, I will be called at the hospital bedside and in tragedies, and people will ask me the question, and we'll talk about this also. How could God allow this to happen? And, and I'll say, you have problems with God? And they'll say, you're darn right, I have problems with God. And my answer is, welcome to the club. And the name of our club is Yisrael, the people who struggle with God. So that brings us to the question of what theologians call theodicy. Theodicy is the question of, if we have this good and powerful and knowing, I often call it the three O's, omniscious, omnipotent, and omnipresent God, how is it possible that evil can exist? How is it possible that tragedy can exist? Question I think we all struggle with, and I deal with lots of time. People will ask me, where was God at Auschwitz? And my answer is always, it's the wrong question. The question is, where was humanity at Auschwitz? God gives us free will. We have the ability to make hospitals or gas chambers. And God apparently doesn't control us when we make those choices. So I would say evil, as horrible as evil is really a consequence of having free will. Tragedy is a bigger problem. In Turkey and Syria right now, there's probably 30,000 people who have died and millions homeless and suffering because of the way tectonic plates move, because of the geology of the earth. COVID killed far more people because of biology. Hurricanes, tsunamis, and so on, cancer, other diseases, that is tragedy. What I would call evil is the result of human choice. Tragedy seems to occur without human choice. For me, at least, tragedy is a much more difficult theological problem than the problem of evil. So here is the analysis that makes sense to me. And my thanks go to Rabbi Harold Kushner and Ed Feinstein. Ed Feinstein's a conservative rabbi, head of a major synagogue here in the Los Angeles area. As you may know, Rabbi Harold Kushner had a son who died of progeria, a horrible disease of aging. His son Aaron died at age 12, having suffered. And Rabbi Feinstein asked the question, what could he have possibly done to do this? And of course, wrote a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Rabbi Feinstein actually struggled with his own cancer, but also, like any rabbi, struggles with these questions all the time. So here is the analysis. According to the laws of logic, this is now not theology, at least one of the following statements has to be false. Statement number one, God is all good and all just. Statement number two, God is all powerful. Statement number three, bad things happen to good people. If God is truly all good, all just, and all powerful, then bad things can't happen to good people, because that would be an act of injustice. I hope everybody is with me at this point. So your take on the theological issue of theodicy depends on which one of these statements you consider to be false. By the way, you can consider them all of them to be false. You can say there is no God, therefore there's no problem. I mean, you may have problems in your life, but there's no theological problem with evil or tragedy, because there's no umpire, there's no regulator, no one's calling the shots. You know, stuff happens. So we're going to look at each of these questions separately. Let's look at number one. God is all good and all just. Let's say that's false. That's actually the God of the philosophers. The God of the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, said that God is the unmoved mover. It's the God of my assumption, number one, who created the universe. The question is that the God who established all these laws of physics and seemed to design a universe to allow life, does God care? Does God have anything to do with goodness in our lives and anything to do with justice? This is God as the laws of physics. By the way, in the book of Job, which is a very important book for this question, this is Job's conclusion. People talk about the patience of Job. Job is not such a short book, 40-something chapters. Job is patient for about a chapter and a half. Not very patient at all. Job rails against God and understands that God is powerful, and he knows the bad things have happened to a good person, namely him. So he argues that God is not good and just. I'm going to jump to number three. How can the statement, bad things happen to good people, be false? How can that possibly be false? One answer is maybe the thing isn't really bad. I know many people who have gone through difficult, horrible times in their lives, and they say upon reflection, you know what, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, but it made me a deeper, more spiritual person. You know, I've seen this in my own life, and I hear this all the time. Maybe the thing really wasn't bad. Or on a different level, and irrespective of what you may think of vaccinations, a baby gets a vaccination against diphtheria and smallpox, and I would add COVID, and from the baby's worldview, a bad thing has happened to a good baby. Namely, the baby's been a good baby. All of a sudden, the baby has a pain in his tush because he's gotten the injection. From the baby's worldview, a bad thing has happened to good little me. From our worldview, it's not a bad thing at all. It's actually a miracle. So one argument is bad things really don't happen. Things are really good when viewed through the eyes of God. Another way of looking at this is maybe no one is really good. So Christians understand this as original sin, that we all are sinners. Going back to the Garden of Eden, no one is really good. So when a bad thing happened to you, you can't argue that you were really good because you're a sinner by nature. Of course, Judaism rejects that idea, but I will point out that Jewish mystical beliefs talk about reincarnation and the idea that one of the Kabbalistic beliefs is that when a bad thing happens to an innocent, let's say a child, it may well be that that child is paying for sins that the child incurred in previous lifetimes. I reject that. There is no question in my mind that bad things do in fact happen to good people. So that leaves us with assumption number two. God is all powerful. This is the conclusion that the idea that God is all powerful is false is the conclusion that Job comes up to. It's the conclusion that Rabbi Kushner comes up to, and it's the conclusion I come up to. And we also see evidence of this actually in the Talmud. There's a wonderful story in the Talmud about, here's the story. There are actually 2 commandments in the Bible for which you are promised a long life. Commandment number 1, honor your father and your mother. If you read the rest of the commandment, in the 10 commandments, it says that you may long live in the land that God is giving to you. And then there's a rather obscure one. It says when you take either eggs or nestlings from a nest, you should shoo away the mother bird, presumably so she won't see you stealing her offspring. And you're promised long life for that. So there's this great story in the Talmud about a father asks his son, take that ladder, climb that tree, and bring me down either nestlings or eggs. And the son says, yes, Dad, goes up, climbs the tree, and takes the eggs, fulfilling the first commandment of honoring his father's wishes. And oh, by the way, the son shoos away the mother bird, fulfilling the second commandment. Both commandments now promise him a long life. On the way down, the ladder breaks and he falls to his death. So now the rabbis are discussing, how is this possible? And the first conclusion they say is, we don't believe the story. And they say, no, we heard the story from Rabbi so-and-so, and we always trust this rabbi. The second thing they say is, well, maybe he was thinking evil thoughts. And the rabbis come up with the Aramaic equivalent of, give me a break. He was obeying 2 commandments. How could he be thinking evil thoughts? And oh, by the way, in Judaism, we are not punished for our thoughts. We are punished for our actions. And so they debate and they debate and they debate and they come up with a brilliant theological insight. What is the brilliant theological insight? The ladder was defective. When he was on his way down, the ladder was rotted out or something, and it broke. And the theology is the world operates according to its own laws. You folks are all, I am sure, wonderful, holy people doing good. You know what? You still need to put on your seatbelts. You still need to take your medications, because the world of biology and physics operates according to its own laws and not based on the tzadikut, how good you all are. The Talmud goes on to say, Din hu, it would be just if somebody stole seeds and planted the seeds that they wouldn't sprout. The God who created the universe could keep those seeds from sprouting, but we know the seeds sprout. They say even more seriously, Din hu, it would be just if a couple committed adultery and produced a child, which is a mamzer, we can talk about that issue, which is a terrible thing. It would be just if the woman wouldn't conceive as a result of adultery. But we know that nature operates under its own laws and God doesn't seem to intervene. A very interesting theological issue is it possible that God cannot intervene or God chooses not to intervene? We can discuss that one for a while if you're interested. I prefer to think of it as God cannot intervene. God set up the laws of physics and biology, and God is powerless to overcome those laws. So then the question is, what good is God? And I think Rabbi Kushner wrote a book. I'm looking for it. Yeah, I'm looking at my bookshelf. The name of the book is Who Needs God? And the answer that Rabbi Kushner comes up with, the answer that makes sense to me, is God's role is as a teacher, inspirer, commander, friend, and companion, but not someone who forces our hand and controls our decision, and not someone who can overcome the laws of physics and nature. So, moving toward the conclusion, a question I often get asked as a rabbi is, God, where have you been lately? You know, we love these stories from the Bible where God seems to intervene and save the Jews, and how come we don't see that happening all the time? So here's an answer that makes sense to me. It's an answer by analogy. The analogy is certainly not an original one for me. It's the analogy of a parent and a growing child. From the worldview of infants, parents work miracles. The infant is crawling along the floor, and heading for something dangerous, and all of a sudden the infant is flying and put into his or her crib, and the wet diaper is magically changed, and nice smelling powder is sprinkled, and oh, by the way, up above are these birds flying, beautiful images, balloons and birds and music, and there's a warm bottle. From the worldview of the child, a miracle has just happened. Manna from heaven. Everything in the midst of danger, I have just been rescued. Child now grows a little bit and is playing in the front yard. And parent says, you know what? Don't go in the street. If you go in the street, you will be hit by a car. Street's dangerous. Don't go in the street. The parent doesn't tell the child, if you go in the street, there's a 10% chance that a car may come along and a 5% chance that the driver may not see you, leading to a 0.5% chance that you may be hit by a car. No, the parent makes it very simple. If you play in the street, you will get hurt. Adolescence. Child now is growing older. I always think of my son, who was an aspiring actor, and in fact now is an actor, and making a living at it. When he was 16, just got his driver's license. He was a pretty good actor, and he was invited to join an acting troupe in Hollywood. So this is, like an hour's drive away. And of course, none of these actors are earning a living acting. So the rehearsal and practice sessions are all in the evening. He's in high school, new driver. He comes to me and says, I've been invited to join this troupe. Can I do it? Of course, my answer is no. Do you think my son's response was, thank you, Father. I didn't appreciate all of the risks and hazards associated with making these evening trips, how it would interfere with my normal schedule, the risk of getting into an accident. I so appreciate and am enlightened by your superior wisdom. I am forever in your debt. No, the discussion doesn't even go close to that. The discussion usually ends in something like, because I'm your father, that's why. And I have adult children now. In fact, my youngest, just turned 40. And I can't work miracles in their life, and I can't control their lives. Occasionally I write a check and it may seem like a miracle to them, but I suspect a number of you in this group have adult children, and you know that you really wish you could work more miracles than just writing an occasional check. But I still have a relationship with them, and that relationship is meaningful to me, and I hope the relationship is meaningful to them. So what's the analogy? My sense of Bible and the miracles that we read about in the Bible is our collective memory of our spiritual infancy. Just like an infant perceives the parent working miracles, we perceive that our parent, capital P, worked miracles. The toddler thing, if you play in the street, you're going to get hit by a car. If you read the book of Deuteronomy, that's what it reads like. If you do these terrible things, you will surely be punished. If you do good things, you will surely be rewarded. The only problem is it's clear to us that this is not true. So that's the book of Deuteronomy is sort of a toddler's eye view of the problem of theodicy and how God works. The book of Job strikes me as a conversation between God and our adolescent selves. To refresh your memory in the book of Job, terrible things happen to Job. Job knows he's innocent, and we know Job is innocent because the narrator tells us Job is innocent. So Job rants and rails against God. Job's friends come along and preach Torah. They preach Deuteronomy. They tell Job, you know what, you must have sinned. Therefore, if you atone for your sin, God will forgive you from your sin and things will be all right. Job refuses to go along with what he knows is false. In fact, Job, in an act of biblical chutzpah, argues and calls God to task. And he demands that God shows up for a trial of Job versus God, where God is judge, jury, and defendant. And Job, is the complainant. And a miracle of miracles, God does show up. And in a series of speeches, beautifully eloquent speeches, God basically says, I'm God, you're not. you can't possibly understand my ways. But in a very powerful one-verse addendum at the end of the story of the book of Job, God says your friends are wrong. Namely, the world is more complex than the simple book of Deuteronomy. I would argue, many scholars agree, that the book of Job comes along as a counter statement to the book of Deuteronomy. So where are we today? I believe today our relationship with God is one like an adult child with an adult parent. God no longer works these miracles for us, but on the other hand, the value of God is as a teacher, a confident, a loving relationship, and that I believe I get much out of, and I also believe God gets much out of. So the question is, does God care? Is there any proof from physics? And I submit the following, although I have convinced very, very, very few people, but I can't resist at least mentioning it, particularly because the pictures are so nice. The total eclipse of the sun. This is from Oregon in 2017. I schlepped my wife along to the deserts of Oregon so we could see this total eclipse of the sun. This was taken by a guy with very sophisticated equipment. And the amazing and astounding thing, as the eclipse started developing, you could see that the size of the moon, the angular size of the moon, was precisely exactly the same size as the sun. Why? Because the sun is 400 times further away from the earth than is the moon, and it's also 400 times larger. So it's perfect. And there's no reason why it should be perfect, except that God so loves us that God wants us to see this beautiful image. Here's more images from the same photographer. This is the most awesome thing I have seen in nature, is the corona. The light intensity from the corona is about the same as a full moon. So you go from full sunlight, and then in an instant you go to what amounts to moonlight. And then, of course, if you know, as you examine, if you have a telescope, you can see these images. So I believe, for me, this is evidence from physics of God caring, because there's no inherent reason why these two things should balance out so perfectly. The next one's coming up in the next few years. It'll be visible over the central United States and Mexico. So my conclusions. Einstein said, science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. And you can consult on my website for lots of other quotes from scientists and religious people on this subject. But I would go further than Einstein. The debate is usually framed as, are science and religion incompatible? And of course, I would say no. I believe one has to do with why is the teapot boiling? Because of heat, that's science. Because of meaning, my wife wants tea, that's religion. Another debate is, do they just address different areas and they have nothing to do with each other? Another level of debate is, are they compatible, that they sort of reinforce each other? And that's where most people stop. But I go one level further than Einstein in this. I would say neither can do its job without the other. I would say religion cannot do the job of religion without science. This is especially clear in the case of Judaism. In the case of Judaism, the purpose of Judaism is to make the world a better place. If the role of religion is to make the world a better place, then we had better understand the world and how it works, and that's science. If I'm sick, pray for me. Knock your socks off. But help me get to a doctor. Send me some chicken soup. Give me the benefit of the world of science. I caught COVID a while ago, like many of you did. Thank God I caught it late enough in the epidemic so that I had the vaccinations, which I think strengthened my immune system. And I had Paxlovid, which I think helped me get through it. That's science. Yes, I thank God for giving us the wisdom to understand science. So I believe religion can't do its job without science. But I would also say science can't do its job without religion. A world of scientific progress, unchecked by religious ethics, leads us to mass murder and probably extinction as a species, and maybe the extinction of all species. We learn from history that when we develop weapons, we use them. And now, thanks to science, and in fact, good Jewish physicists like Einstein, we now have weapons that can wipe out the world. The estimate is that something like a dozen hydrogen bombs could wipe out humanity, and there are hundreds and thousands of hydrogen bombs. So the question is, what is going to keep us from going into a world marked by nuclear war? I submit to you, it is religious ethics. So my bottom lines are, there is nothing irrational about belief in God and the belief that God exists. If we live as though God exists and cares, our lives are better and the world is better. I believe that God exists. I felt a calling to become a rabbi, but you don't have to be a rabbi. You know, we have mitzvot, we have commandments about visiting the sick, about raising, you know, using tzedakah to feed the hungry. If we follow these rules, the world is a better place, and I certainly believe that my life is enriched by it. God may not even exist, but if we live as though God exists, I believe our lives, both individually and collectively, are improved. If we are to survive and thrive, we better study both science and religion. And my bottom line is Dayenu. It's enough for me. I think I have, I'm going to skip the blind and the elephant and just jump to the final slide here. I did write a book. Most of us now have non-Jews in our family, and I wrote a book for them. You can find this on Amazon and other sources, or you can go to my website, lotker.com, or send me an email, lotker@aol.com. You know, Moses had an AOL account, and I have an AOL account. We may be the last two. And also, I do a lot of online teaching. So if you want to get emails from me about my online teaching schedule, just pop me an email to lotker@aol.com, and I'll be happy to, you know, include you when I have teaching. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to take a quick look at the chat, see if there's a question here. Okay. Yeah, so there's only one question. Bertha Strauss asked the question, which I will address. Why pray? If God is power, if God doesn't have power, why pray to God? So one of the insights there I learned is the Hebrew word for prayer, the verb to pray, is lehitpalel, which is a reflexive verb. And the verb means literally to examine yourself. I don't believe God needs our prayers, but I believe we need to be the kind of people that turn to God. And ultimately, one of the things that I think is important, for me at least, in prayer, is once you pray is also to stop and listen, to hear God responding to your prayers. And that for me has been life-changing. And the other thing, particularly in Judaism, we pray because we come together as a community to pray. When I've gone through some of the most difficult times in my life, I was at Friday services, and I would, you know, announce people for whom I'm praying as a Misha Berach, and people will come over to me and ask me, you know, what's wrong, what's going on, how can I help, you know, can I visit? You know, my late wife was in a nursing home for 12 years. Can I visit her? Can I bring some food? Oh, I know a massage therapist that might help her. That is a result of me coming to Friday night services. Do I believe that God miraculously can hear my prayers and change the genes in my wife? She had a genetic disease. No. Do I believe that in the course of praying, I connect with my community, and that community can and does help me? And also I center myself. And does that help me? Absolutely. So with that answer, I will call on Stephen, and unmute yourself and ask away.
We need God. Does God need us?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So remember, I said, why is there a universe? And the one answer is all of the physics, and the second answer is because God wanted a universe. So that actually raises the question you ask, Stephen, why did God want to create a universe? There's two traditional answers to that. One I really don't like, and that answer is, if God is to be praised, then God needs a hallelujah chorus. If God is to be praised, then God needs people to praise God. I really don't like that one. The other one that I like, which leads to really the response to your question, is that God likes stories, or even that God is lonely. So we worship a God that is personal. I mean, there are other religions and even other branches of Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, in theory, worship is sort of a non-personal God. People said God created us in the divine image, and we did the same thing. So if we are created in God's image, we are people that want connection and company. The word religion comes from the same root word as the word for ligament, connection. And in Judaism, the central teaching is that God created the universe, but didn't take it to conclusion. That God created a universe partially and now needs our help in completing creation. That's actually one of the central insights of Kabbalah, of mysticism, is that God can't do it by God's self. So we worship, either God actually is this nature, or we project this nature upon God, of a God who wants to be in partnership, a God who wants to be in brit, in covenant with people. That's our image of God, and you can't be in covenant with no one. So that's as good as I can do. It's not essential, but the Kabbalists would say God needs us to complete creation according to the plan that God has in mind. Other questions or thoughts? Yes,
Yes.
Sandra. Sandra and then Nora. Go ahead.
Putting together your lecture, I feel like I come away with two levels of prayer. One level is just sort of straightforward, let me win $1 million or something, let my family member get well, and expecting God to just intervene and do it. And the other level is more like, give me the strength to deal with these things.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, and I'll add one insight. I on my website you'll also find YouTube classes on Kabbalah, on Jewish mysticism. I would be happy to come back and do this again on mysticism. And I distinguish between magic and mystic, and particularly magical prayer and magical living and mystical living. Magical living is like your first level of prayer. Magical thinking in Judaism would be, if I obey the commandments, I keep strictly kosher, I wear this funny little hat, I put funny little scrolls on my doorposts, I pray 3 times a day, and including some Aramaic and some Hebrew, and I do all of the mitzvot, or as many of the mitzvot as I can possibly do. If I do all those things, magical thinking is God will follow my will. I'll win the lottery, I'll get the $1 million, my kid will be healed, and so on. Mystical thinking, Kabbalistic thinking, sounds very similar. It's the same list of things. If I obey the commandments, if I keep kosher, if I have the mezuzot and pray and so on and so on, if I do all of those things, not that God will follow my will, but I will follow God's will. So I will become an agent for God in the world. And for me, that it follows then that I have the strength to struggle with the ills of the world. I hope that's helpful. Nora.
Yeah, getting back to the example you gave about your wife being sick, and you didn't think that praying to God would help change her genes. But what about praying that the scientists would come up with a way to,
Yes. Amen. And that's my prayer. My prayer is always that science will come up with ways, and there are treatments now, but not really cures. But there are treatments. We have COVID, but there are treatments. And I always pray that scientists, instead of going down 20 or 30 wrong paths, that God will inspire them first to be scientists. Their angels are working in the laboratories on cures to disease. And I also thank and appreciate God for sending angels into my wife's life. And, one of my daughters, because of the same disease, is now in a nursing home. And she has angels in her life as she got sicker and sicker, of people who would show up to care for her and help take care of her. So that's my prayer. I don't pray for miracles in the sense of things that violate the laws of physics. I pray for miracles in terms of things that, through inspiration, scientific, ethical, and otherwise, will make our lives better. And that's why I want people to be religious. I want governments to be secular, but I want people to be religious and work on these problems. But yeah, absolutely, Nora. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Other questions, comments, alternative sermons?
So why do you think the DNA is so hard to replicate in
It's a highly complex molecule. I mean, I'm not there may well be people here that know the answer better than I. The structure as a double helix, the DNA splits and then replicates by attracting chemicals that are the same partners. It's highly complicated. But my point is, it's so complicated we're unable to do it. So then the question is, can we really believe that it happened by accident? And oh, by the way, you can calculate the probability. And I'll refer you to Piccioni's book, which is in a bibliography that I have online, to calculate the probability. And the probability is equivalent to pulling an ace of spades from a deck of cards 118,000 times in a row. So is it proof? I have to be intellectually honest and say it's not proof. Is it overwhelming evidence? That's what I would say it is.
Thank you.
And more importantly, people argue that believing in God and these things is anti-intellectual. I would say if I take the Bible literally, then I have all kinds of problems. Was the universe made in 6 days or 12.5 billion years? Can I believe in both? By the way, you can believe both. Through relativity, if some of you may be familiar with relativistic time dilation, it can be literally true. It'd take 10 minutes to explain that 6 days in God's world is actually 12.5 billion years in our world. That can be true in the world of physics. That's just special relativity and time dilation, which we know is a fact. It's not a theory, it's a fact. But, there's a lot of other things in the Bible, in Joshua, the sun stands still. There's a zillion things in the Bible which are inconsistencies. And if I take the Bible literally, I have all kinds of problems, but I don't take it literally. For me, it is the sacred myth of our people that teaches. I often compare it with the story of the boy who cried wolf. We know the story of the boy who cried wolf. Did it literally happen the way the story tells it? The answer is, at best, who knows? In reality, probably no. But the power of that story is not in its historicity. It's not in its literal truth. The power of the story is in the lesson that it teaches. And to me, that's how I understand Bible and Talmud. The power is not in the literal history. The power is in the moral lessons that it teaches.
All right, well, thank you. It was
Okay, well, it's wonderful for me to
wonderful.
connect with all of you in the old country. Out here in California, we call New York City the old country. And I'm delighted to have been invited, and hope you'll invite me again. It's so simple. I even have I got 10 minutes before I have to run off and do something else, but it's so easy to do so thanks to Zoom and electronics and your invitation.
And science.
And science, right? So again, if you so something else in the chat, thank you for the nice words. If you want to have to drop in on these things on a regular basis, send me an email, lotker@aol.com, and I will be happy to add you to my email list. There's no charge, although most of my classes are 7 o'clock at night Pacific time. But again, they're all recorded on YouTube. So those that have signed up for the classes, I send out a follow-up email saying if you want to view it. And I have lots of people that view it on YouTube. So again, thank you very much. Hope
Thank you.
spring arrives and the
Thank
weather
you.
as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you for a great
Thank
lecture.
you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
very good. Very interesting.
I am not going to rush off in case there's any kind of last minute things.
Hi, Rabbi Lotker. Would you be able to put your email in the chat?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay, it is now in the chat.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, that's right. You're not seeing the image there. I stopped screen sharing. Okay, I'm going to take off and move on to other things. And again, thank you for the invitation. My guess is when I sign off, this will end the meeting. So take care.
Thank you.